Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 25th of June. Today we'll be doing a regular frontline update, but I don't want to completely forget about the events that unfolded over the past few days with the Wagner mutiny, because there's so many unanswered questions about that entire situation, which I still have, and I'm sure that we'll get some answers, but we might not get all of them answered in the near future. Just to sort of list some of them off, I'm very interested to see where Prigozhin actually is located right now, because the truth of the matter is we don't know where he actually is right now. We know that he was supposed to be granted safe passage to Belarus, but he hasn't actually been reported as being in Belarus as of the latest news. And there's also some conflicting reports saying that Belarus will only be an intermediary stop point for him, and that he will actually make his way to Africa, because Wagner does have some significant bases and significant connections within Africa in different African countries. You know, Libya, they have connections there. Central African Republic, they're very present there, supporting the government forces. Also in Mali, they do have a certain presence, which is very popular with the government over there. And so they do have certain connections in these areas. And there is a possibility that Prigozhin will go over there. Also the possibility that he stays in Belarus once he actually reaches that point. And then we're all gonna wait and see to determine whether the Wagner Group will actually set up different sort of posts on the border with Ukraine, because this is a real fear that is being circulated by Western politicians, especially in Europe. And they're talking about now beefing up the border security between Poland and Belarus due to this potential threat that the Wagner Group will be moving some of their men to the border with Belarus. But from what I've seen, the majority of the Wagner Group's men, they are either going to sign new contracts for the MOD, or they're just going to be sent back to Ukraine, to their original bases in Donetsk and Luhansk. And so they're still going to be recuperating on the rear, but they're going to be in Ukraine, on the eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, not on the border with Belarus and Ukraine in the north. So that's why I have the Wagner Group logo back in Popasnaya, which is the city that they first took, and that they have a huge field base over there. So I'm just putting it there because there's not really any other place that I could put the Wagner Group on that will make any sense. Also, I'm very interested to see what happens with the defense ministry in Russia. I am interested to see whether Gerasimov and Shoigu and maybe some other higher ups in the upper echelons of the defense ministry, maybe not even just the defense ministry, maybe even the National Guard, maybe even the FSB, the police in the military itself, maybe some of them will also be on the chopping block because of their response to the events over the past few days, perhaps not showing enough loyalty, showing incompetence, which isn't really all added up. And Prigozhin's been speaking a lot about that, and that might be a part of the conditions that he's agreed to as a part of the agreement that was mediated by Lukashenko between Putin and Prigozhin. So I am interested to see what happens in that regard, whether Shoigu is kicked out, and whether, like, Surovikin, for instance, who's more of a hardliner, is put in as a defense minister, which is certainly a possibility, but we don't know what will happen in that regard just yet. So that's another question that I have. We have to wait and see about that. But in terms of the front line, let's talk about the situation in Kherson, because we've been receiving a lot of reports from this direction over the past few days. And I want to clarify that the Ukrainians have had a bridgehead across the Dnieper River for a couple of months now. And it's not a totally solid bridgehead, because sometimes you have crews from Ukrainian special forces that are coming in and out of the river. They're going on their speedboats. They are permanently stationed in Kherson, obviously, and in some other towns around there. And then every now and then, like every night, you could say, that's when they cross over the river and set up their positions around some of these dachas, some of these more sparsely populated towns where you have these cottages and you have some docks and different marshes and different like bush lines and forested areas on islands. And they are on very low-lying elevation, and so they're receiving artillery cover from the Ukrainian artillery further up to the north. But then these are very small mobile groups that are trying to hide. They're not trying to conduct massive breakthroughs. They're mainly doing these probing operations and reconnaissance operations. They've been doing these for really many months now. And so they have the most active presence directly to the south of the city of Kherson, of course, where there are some docks and some dachas that are under their regular control. The Russians, they have their positions a bit further to the south because there are a few towns over here. And you have different Russian motorized brigades that are taking control over these towns and trying to push back the Ukrainians whenever they cross the river. And so it seems like the most amount of fighting has been recorded around the Antonovsky Bridge, which of course is still destroyed, so nobody's crossing over that bridge. But you do have speedboats coming in at night, and according to the reports that I read, there were about 50 men engaged over the past few days across the river fighting against the Russian forces in this direction. And so it's a very small amount of people. You don't want to bring too many people into this area because you're going to be exposed, and you want to be very mobile, move around quickly because the Russians, they're shelling this area. They have drone crews operating here, and then there's also these firefights, and you want to go from house to house pretty quickly. And a lot of the Ukrainian forces in this area, from what I was seeing from the footage, they're actually hiding under the bridge to provide them with cover, also hiding within some of these houses. And that's when you see these videos from the Russian sources of different drones dropping bombs and dropping explosives onto their positions. And then they have to like withdraw and move to some other house. And so that's the nature of the fighting over here. The Russians, they don't have many men either in this direction. They do have some like forward positions around Dachi, but Dachi is sort of contested. Ukrainians have most of the positions on the western part of the town, and the Russians more on the eastern side of the town. And then the most Ukrainian activity is obviously directly to the south of the Antonovsky Bridge, where you do have a significant Ukrainian presence in relative terms, and where the Russians were forced to withdraw a bit further to the south due to the Ukrainian presence and the Ukrainian pressure due to the machine gun firings. Some of the machine guns were actually being fired across the river, but then you also have firing positions within some of these houses. And so it is sort of like house-to-house fighting in a way. There are some geolocated videos that I have over here provided. There's one of Russian troops actually evacuating their forward positions from the Antonovsky Bridge. And as the Russian troops were withdrawing, some of them were actually injured. There was one Russian BTR 80 or 82 that was providing fire support, and it was firing onto the Ukrainian positions to distract those gunners as the wounded and the other men in these forward positions began to withdraw along the E97 highway a bit further to the south to more fortified Russian positions around the town of Oleksy, which is really one of these larger hubs for the Russian military in this entire sector, one of the largest cities that Russia has under its control within Kherson at the moment. And so in terms of the fighting over here, there are some pretty significant firefights, and the Ukrainians are trying to like counteract the Russian drone activity by bringing in their own jamming crews. And so they're electronically jamming a lot of these drones, trying to disable them, sometimes successfully, which has been able to disrupt a lot of the Russian smaller scale attacks, because you can't really call on an airstrike every single time that you see a Ukrainian soldier in these areas because they move by so quickly. So it's easier to use a drone in some instances, but a lot of them are getting jammed as a result. It's also causing certain issues with communication due to these electronic jamming crews, which is preventing coordination between the men on the ground and the local command centers, and also it's making it more difficult to call in airstrikes whenever you notice a certain accumulation of men or equipment. Usually the equipment is shipped in at night when it's harder to see, and they do it on speedboats, so it's very quick. You can't really shell a speedboat that's going very quickly around such a narrow river. It's very difficult to do that, which is why the Ukrainians have been able to transport most of their equipment unimpeded, but of course they have to do it at night, and they have to be pretty secretive about it. But that's generally the situation. There's no breakthrough for the Ukrainians in this area. This is not really the beginning of a major offensive across the Dnieper River. I think that they're still in the phase of trying to probe the best areas and trying to establish the proper conditions for a bridgehead, although I do see the Ukrainians definitely trying to cross over here with significant numbers in the future, because it does seem like a good way of sort of bypassing the fortifications that were built by the Russians in Zaporizhzhia and then taking over all of these lower elevated areas around Kherson where Russia does have less of a presence. But I would also add that Ukraine doesn't have much of a presence here either. So for the time being, it is on a much smaller scale that the Ukrainians are conducting these attacks. Although, as I said before, over the past few days, the fighting here has ramped up, and the Ukrainians have been able to establish more permanent bridgeheads. And again, look at the map. This is what I mean by the bridgehead. It's a very narrow area, very small area. It doesn't allow for many units, many men to cross by, and it is sometimes temporary. Sometimes you have to have these 50 men withdrawing across the river due to certain issues, due to certain Russian attacks, due to a lack of supplies, if that's the case. And so it is very fluid in this area. I don't want people to think that there's an impending offensive just yet in this direction. Well, let's move on to the situation around Zaporizhzhia, where the Ukrainians have been able to advance a bit towards Robotyne. Here is the general direction in which they're attacking, and they have been able to advance along the highway that connects Robotyne to Orkiv. So it's really centered around a singular road, which is certainly an issue because you have your entire column being concentrated in one area and advancing in that direction. But there's also another parallel Ukrainian attack towards the nature reserve that the Russians had taken over beforehand called Balka Uspanivska. And so now this nature reserve over here is currently contested, with the Ukrainians making some gains over there. A bit to the east, you have Ukrainian gains that have been occurring over the past few days as the Wagner forces were mutinying within Russia itself. That probably did cause a lack of communication as the Wagner group took over the Southern Military District, which is also responsible for the coordination of the entire SMO because it's based off of Rostov, and that's where the Russian Ministry of Defense was communicating with the front line and trying to give them commands throughout the entire war. And so even if the situation got resolved in 24 hours, for that moment there was a lot of confusion. But despite that fact, the front line did not collapse whatsoever. And I'm going through the gains right now that Ukraine achieved, but I think that they would have been able to make most of these gains either way. So I don't think that the 24 hours where there was a lack of communication really played that large of a role in what I'm about to describe, because a lot of this started before the entire situation with Wagner. So for instance, Levadne had been taken previously by the Ukrainians, but after the Wagner mutiny in 24th, 23rd, they were able to sort of advance along some of these open fields, taking over a cemetery, just pushing in about 1.5 kilometers deeper into the Russian lines. But that's about it. They were trying to approach Pryutne, but they haven't reached that area yet, and you have some Russian forces in that direction. That's about it from that area. The Ukrainians were also able to fully take control over of Makarivka, but the Ukrainians have not been able to advance towards Storomayorsk or Ruzhanye, so Russia's still holding on to those positions. The Ukrainians also did make a minor push towards some of the open fields directly to the west of Makarivka, and the goal was to reach Rivnopil, or at least to try to flank it, because that's the Russian forward positions over there. But that has been unsuccessful as of yet. We'll have to wait and see about that. Now let's move on to Krasnohorivka. I really should have talked about this earlier, but anyway, on the 22nd, the Ukrainians were able to conduct a limited counterattack to the east of Krasnohorivka, where the Russians have been really trying to push for over a year now. A very fortified area, and the lines have barely moved since 2014 in this specific sector. So the Ukrainians have now been able to solidify control over this local fortress, where there's a couple of houses, actually apartment buildings as well. So it's a good area to sort of set up firing positions and dominate the nearby open fields. There's also some trenches over here you can see. I'm sure they're more robust. If you were there on the ground, you could see it. And this overlooks the Russian positions to the east and gives cover for the Ukrainian positions in Krasnohorivka. And the most notable thing that occurred was that the Ukrainians were able to push along this rail line and take over certain positions that Russia previously held in the two bush lines to the north and to the south of that rail line. And what made it significant is that the Ukrainians actually pushed so far to the east with their advance that they were able to pass through their original lines in 2014, their original trench lines that they had dug in 2014, and take over some of the Russian lines that had existed since 2014, or you could say the DPR lines. So this is what they took from the DPR that was under their control since 2014. This is the full amount that they were able to take over. So you can see it's incredibly small. So when I'm talking about this, I'm not really saying it in order to say that Ukraine has some like major tactical or operational, in this case, would be an operational advantage in this specific sector. As a result, it just to show that they made this minor gain in this area for the sake of updating the map. It doesn't really mean much of anything, actually. It just means that they were able to push a little bit to the east in this area with the rail line. But let's move on to Bakhmut, where we do have some changes to the front line. The Ukrainians have been able to clear out the entirety of the western side of the Donbass water canal. So now it's all under Ukrainian control. This is very good news for them, because there was always this fear that the Russians would concentrate their forces across the river, across the canal, because they already had the forward positions, and then, you know, push maybe to the south towards Donetsk, maybe push towards Konstantinivka, definitely try to cut off the highway connecting Bakhmut to Konstantinivka, and then perhaps even go for Chasiv Yar. And that was only a possibility due to the fact that the Russians had this bridgehead across the canal. But now the Ukrainians have been able to fully clear it out, which also gives them the advantage of being right next to several key Russian towns in this area, such as Kordenivka and Ozaranivka. These two towns serve as local supply hubs, local coordination hubs. There were several field headquarters in this area, so it is an important operating base for the Russians, and now it's very close to the Ukrainian lines. The Ukrainians could actually cross the canal and begin attacking these towns, and it could also provide a way for the Ukrainians to sort of flank the Russian position in this area. They could cross over here, try to fight for Kuryumivka and Ozaranivka, and then also flank the positions to the south of Klishivka if they were successful in taking over these towns. I don't think they will be for the time being, because Russia does have a significant amount of manpower in this direction, in this town cluster of Kuryumivka. It's also a supply hub. There's a rail line going through there, although I don't think it's really working right now. But there are different roads that branch out from Kuryumivka to the front line, and I do know that it's one of the larger towns that Russia has under its control in this area. So it is important now that they maintain control over it. I also think that they'll move some of their forward operating bases a bit to the east, maybe to Kadema, which was previously in the forward operating base when Wagner took it over, maybe even to the Uglegorsk power plant or Novoluhansk. Those are also significant towns in this general, what I call Bakhmut sector. Then to the north, the Ukrainians, they were able to make minor gains around the forests of Ivanivske. So they have been able to approach Klishivka from a new direction, a bit to the west. And so they're trying to shape the battlefield in a way to try to begin assaults onto Klishivka. That's their objective. They've already advanced pretty close to Klishivka from the north. And now they're trying to also take over the forested areas to the west and flank them from that position. Let's move on to the situation on the northern flank of Bakhmut, where the Ukrainians for a while now have had full control over Orikovo-Vasilivka. It was previously contested, but the Ukrainians took it back due to, first of all, Wagner leaving, which sort of left the flanks more uneasy and allowed for Ukraine to conduct more limited counterattacks, which they were unable to do beforehand. And so since then, the Ukrainians have been able to push through this one specific valley, which is over here. I'm showing it with the blue arrows. So there's one valley, and there's one road spanning the entire valley that the Ukrainians are advancing through. And you can see the general bulge of how they're pushing in that direction. I'm going to add color to the map. It's just that I got a new mouse now, so I'm going to be able to click on the polygons faster and make new dots and form them into lines and then shapes. But anyway, you can see the bulge over here as the Ukrainians are trying to push in this direction towards the town of Dubovo-Vasilivka. So a lot of the fighting is going on in that direction. And then the goal would eventually be to reach Berkivka and cut off the northern junction with all these different roads. The E40 highway, the road from the north, to, like from Soledar to Bakhmut, the road from Yakovlivka to Bakhmut. All of these roads, they connect at this one junction. And the goal would be for the Ukrainians to advance along this one valley all the way to this key area to cut off supplies into Bakhmut from the north. That's generally their aim. So that's why there's fighting in Dubovo-Vasilivka. But the thing is, the Russians do still hold the high ground in this area. There is a more hilly ridge, you could say, just to the north of this valley that overlooks Berkivka, that overlooks Dubovo-Vasilivka. also overlooks Zaporizhzhia, where the Ukrainians have been trying to counterattack for a while now. And so it gives the Russians and whatever forward operating troops they have over here, if they have like a mortar crew or an ATGM crew, it gives them some pretty advantageous positions to fire upon the Ukrainian forces as they attempt to advance. And so that could prove to be a potential issue for the Ukrainians as they continue their advance in this direction. Maybe they should try to take over this hilly area first before they continue attacking Dubovo-Vasilivka. But anyway, that's all I have for today. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next update. Goodbye.